Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We are now live on Facebook for the quarterly community forum from the consent decree monitoring team. Tonight, as we present, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the comment box. We will relay them to our speakers and try to answer them in real time as best we can. You may engage through the comment section on Facebook through the entirety of our forum. We're so glad you could join us here today, and we look forward to hearing from you, your thoughts and concerns as we present about where the consent decree is in Baltimore today. Ray or Darnell, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our 11th quarterly report forum. So this is the monitoring team's opportunity to update the community on what's happened in the past 3 months with the consent decree, as well as give insight on the upcoming court hearing later on this week. So we want to jump right into it. There's been a lot that's happened since we've last met. So I just want to go through and say who's on the call tonight. We have the lead monitor, Ken Thompson, as well as deputy monitors, Chuck Ramsey and Seth Rosenthal. Myself, Ray Kelly, is the lead community liaison. And we also have fielding the Facebook Live, the community engagement coordinator, Darnell Wharton, and also Jessica Drake on the technical end. So I want to just jump right into Ken with the updates, and we'll get to as many questions and updates as possible. So let's get it started, and I'll pass it to Ken.
Well, thank you, Ray, and thank all of you for participating in our, Ray said 11th, boy, time flies, our 11th quarterly forum. These are always very important to the monitoring team because this is one of our better opportunities to hear from the public in general. And so we welcome your questions. I'm not going to talk too long, excuse my raspy voice, but it's most of you probably understand this is allergy season. So if you've got allergies, I hope you you sympathize with me. This has really been an extremely eventful last 12 months from many, many different perspectives, from COVID to a change in administration, to the debate or debates surrounding systemic racism. This is a year that folks in this country have really been forced to look deep into what President Biden often refers to as the soul of America. Now, among the more prominent movements on the national and state level is the effort to engage in police reform. There is pending in the US Congress currently the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act of 2021. Closer to home, we have the Maryland Police Accountability Act of 2021, which was recently passed by the Maryland legislature. These efforts and others around the country are designed to mandate substantial changes in how police departments conduct themselves in an effort to restore trust between the various departments and the communities that they serve. Now, all of this causes me, and hopefully it causes many of us, to reflect on BPD, Baltimore Police Department, and the critical importance of the consent decree. The consent decree, as most, if not all of you know, is the blueprint for police reform in this city. And interestingly enough, many of the reforms reflected in the reform efforts around the country, including those recently passed in Maryland, reflect many of the provisions already encompassed in the BPD consent decree. In any event, in order for the city and BPD to come out from under federal court supervision, they are required to comply with a whole host of reform obligations. And like the reform efforts around the country, these requirements are designed to transform BPD into a 21st century police department. So what does all this mean? Well, the 500 plus paragraphs that make up the consent decree are all designed in one way or another to, as I said before, to rebuild trust between the department and the community. And while there are a number of areas that these paragraphs address, all of equal importance, let me spend just a few minutes discussing just a couple. Let me start with use of force. The heart of this requirement mandates that BPD's policies and training focus on de-escalation and the utilization of the least amount of force necessary to effectuate an arrest if circumstances dictate. Officers are taught to value the sanctity of life and are no longer to look at themselves as warriors, but instead as guardians for the communities they took an oath to serve and to protect. In the area of stops, searches, and arrests, the consent decree requires that the policies and the training in this area focus intently on demanding that officers respect the constitutional rights of all with whom they interact. Specifically, they must have they being the police officers must have reasonable articulable suspicion to stop someone and probable cause to search or arrest an individual. And all of these actions, as the consent decree dictates, must be devoid of any bias. That is to say, race, color, gender identity, religion, etc., should not and cannot play any role in the decision to engage in these law enforcement activities. Another area I would like to discuss briefly is the requirement that BPD and the city come up with better strategies to address interactions with folks with behavioral disabilities or who are in crisis. The consent decree recognizes that more involvement from the mental health provider community is likely a much better way to address these issues. And accordingly, the consent decree directs the city and BPD to put in place appropriate systems to make this happen. So let's just take a few minutes to look at a few, and I just say it's just a few because many things have been done, but a few of the many things that BPD has done to follow this blueprint over the last few years. So starting first and going back to use of force, BPD has put in place policies and training that really and truly represent national best practices, which again emphasize de-escalation and least amount of force concepts. In terms of responding to calls for service to address individuals exhibiting mental health issues, BPD and the city are working to develop systems that will divert, where feasible, these calls to mental health professionals and or social workers and away from the criminal justice system. Now, I used the term guardian a few minutes ago, and that term personifies to me, what the community policing plan is all about. In essence, the community policing plan envisions police officers engaging with the community, working as partners to solve public safety issues in the respective communities. And these efforts and others I would term as works in progress, recognizing the department is moving in the right direction and is on the right road to success, but they've got a long way to go. There remain a number of significant challenges. So let me just mention just a couple, both of which unfortunately involve staffing. First, staffing in general remains a serious challenge. In addition to not having enough patrol personnel on the streets, until the department can really figure out how to hire sufficient personnel to comply with the community policing plan requirement that officers spend 40% of their time engaging with the community and 60% responding to calls for service. Until they can find enough personnel to satisfy this requirement, BPD will not be able to come out from under the federal consent decree. In other words, they will remain under federal court supervision until they can figure out a way to fix that. That's a very serious challenge. Let me go to the other really important agency within the department, that's Internal Affairs. And again, while this unit has made good progress in a number of different areas, they continue, which is not surprising because this is pretty much the case with most of the department. They continue to have a shortage of the right kind, and I emphasize the word right kind of investigator to investigate officers charged with misconduct. It's simply not enough to fill those slots. That's true throughout the department. You want qualified officers who know what they're doing and who understand the nature of being a guardian versus a warrior. But in particular with Internal Affairs, you're dealing with investigators who have to investigate brother police officers. And it just takes a special talent to do that. And of course, this department is woefully short in that area. And of course, what that means is that officers who should have their cases tried and either exonerated or having the charges sustained, they're sitting around for a longer period of time than is necessary. And perhaps most critical or most important is that those officers who perhaps should not be on the force are lingering around a lot longer than they should. So this is going to be a challenge to the department. It's something that the monitoring team and the Department of Justice look at very carefully because we recognize that in rebuilding trust between the community and the department, the department's going to have to show that they can police themselves. And right now, without sufficient personnel, they are a little bit behind the eight ball. They're trying to move in the right direction, but staffing has got to be addressed. But let me come back for a second to what I call the plus side of the ledger. The department now has a new RMS system, records management system, which is moving along quite a pace. It's coming on board. Should be hopefully operational this year. And that will permit the department and the monitoring team to collect and assess data that they respectively need for a variety of reasons. Now, from the department's perspective, the data will allow the department to run a more efficient operation, including the ability, and this is critical, including the ability to identify potential problems or potential problem officers early on in the process. And in terms of the monitoring team, having the available data, this will provide us with the necessary data to determine if, for example, stops, searches, and arrests are being done. Again, I use the term bias-free. In other words, even if there is probable cause and even if there are other factors that may be present, we also want to make sure that people are not being singled out because of their race, their gender identification, their sexual orientations, whatever. So overall, the monitoring team is seeing some of the early stage reform successes bearing fruit. BPD has been featured in national publications and recognized as having had among the best responses to last year's protests concerning George Floyd's murder. The training academy has made significant progress. This is really probably the unit that has outshined all others. And they have made significant progress in delivering first-rate training to BPD officers. And of course, in recognition of these accomplishments, this academy, the BPD Academy, is one of only 6 academies in the nation to be selected to participate in something called the Academy Innovation Project, which is a really, really big deal. And sticking with the academy for a second, recently the commander of that academy, Major Martin Bartness, he was asked and indeed provided testimony to Senator Cory Booker's subcommittee on criminal justice and counterterrorism on the subject of behavioral health and policing, essentially outlining what Baltimore is doing to advance that, not, I won't call it a restructuring, but it's that it is reimagining how the police department needs to respond to people who have mental health issues. And so finally, and while it is anecdotal, BPD officers used, and this is the data that we have looked at, it used less force in 2019 as compared to 2018. Specifically, the number of incidents declined between those 2 years by 15.5%. Now, I say this is anecdotal because we are in the process right now of doing another compliance review for, I think, years 2018, 19, and 20. And we'll get a better idea of what all this means as we conduct these reviews. But it's certainly good news to see that use of force incidents has declined, whatever the reason. Now, all of this is to say that while BPD has an incredible amount of work left to be done to come into full compliance with the consent decree, they are moving in the right direction. And while they get credit for a lot of the hard work, and they should get credit for a lot of the hard work, it must be said, and I'm going to say it tonight, that their efforts have been greatly aided by the community's involvement in the drafting of policies and the participation in the creation of training curricula in many, many critical areas. This process, ladies and gentlemen, will only succeed if all hands are on deck. Both BPD and the community have to work together to make this an effective constitutional police force. So those are my initial comments. Let me turn this over to Seth and then to Chuck if they want to make some preliminary comments.
Thanks a lot, Ken. I don't have any additional comments. Seems like you have covered the waterfront for now, and look forward to hearing folks' questions.
And I agree. You did an excellent job. You know, the community policing training the pilot training is taking place. And we appreciate the comments that people made when they had a chance to review the curriculum that was sent out for their review. I think this is going to be very, very good training that's going to take place. It's really going to make a difference. And as Ken mentioned earlier, staffing continues to be an issue, but the department is moving forward anyway. I mean, it's not something we can really afford to wait on. So again, when any policy comes out for review, please take time to review it. Your comments do matter. And as Ken mentioned, the only way this will happen in a timely fashion if it is all hands on deck. That includes the community as well as the department working hard to make the changes needed. So with that, I'll turn it back to you there, Ken.
And Ray, I'll turn it back to you and Darnell for questions.
If we don't have any Facebook questions, do we, Darnell?
We do not right now.
So I just wanted to circle back. So Ken, I heard you mention the Maryland's reform package, and there's been multiple legislative changes that happened this year. And I've been fielding a lot of questions on how those legislative changes will actually impact, or if they will in any way impact Baltimore's consent decree. So I just wanted to know if one of you guys wanted to make a comment on that.
I'll turn it over to Seth.
Thanks, Ken. And Ray, obviously, this is a question on the top of the minds of a lot of folks in Baltimore, is whether the recently passed reform legislation is going to have an impact on the consent decree. We are looking at that issue in conjunction with the police department, the city, and the Justice Department right now. In fact, we're having a meeting tomorrow afternoon, a Zoom meeting for an hour to discuss it, because one of the things that Judge Berdar wants us to address on Friday, at least preliminarily, is that issue exactly. And we're going to have a meeting in June with the judge, and we're going to file something with him before that meeting to give him a more fully informed view. The short answer is that we are not entirely sure yet whether the legislation will have an impact on any particular provision of the consent decree. But we do have at least a preliminary sense of some of the areas that I'm going to say that could be impacted. But the reality is that there aren't many areas that could be impacted because as Ken said at the outset of the meeting, the consent decree actually is very forward-looking in that it covers a lot of the ground that the reform legislation covers. And so with respect to use of force, the consent decree already embodies the use of force standard that the new Maryland law prescribes. With respect to certain data collection, the consent decree already requires Baltimore Police Department to collect some of that data. The consent decree does not ban no-knock warrants or limit no-knock warrants, but it contains certain provisions that pertain to no-knock warrants, and there's nothing inconsistent with the reform legislation about no-knock warrants with the limitations that the legislation imposes. There are a couple of areas that there's no direct contradiction, but it looks like there will be an impact. One is that the consent decree was drafted against the backdrop of the commissioner being the one to impose discipline, and the commissioner, at the end of the day, under the consent decree, well, under BPD policy and therefore under the consent decree, has ultimate discretion about what punishment to impose, whether recommended by the Public Integrity Bureau at the end of an investigation, or whether recommended by a trial board at the end of the trial board process, should an officer choose to contest the findings and recommendations of the Public Integrity Bureau. Under the new law, as many of you know, there will be an administrative charging committee that is composed entirely of community members. And it will be that charging committee that prescribes discipline according to a disciplinary matrix that is crafted at the state level. Rather than each police department having their own disciplinary matrix, under the new law, the state is supposed to have a disciplinary matrix that applies across the board to every police department in the state. And so you really have two differences there. One is that the commissioner at the end of the day either has to impose the recommendation made by this administrative charging committee composed of entirely civilians, or can go higher, but the commissioner will no longer have the discretion to go below what is being recommended. So that's one difference. And the other difference, which I just mentioned, is that when the administrative charging committee makes its decisions, and therefore when the commissioner is required to make his or her decision, now his decision with Commissioner Harrison, that decision will be guided entirely by a disciplinary matrix, not crafted by Baltimore Police Department, but one crafted at the state level. Now, it may well be that Baltimore's disciplinary matrix, which is actually undergoing revisions right now, that's part of the reform process under consent decree, could end up being the same disciplinary matrix that the state adopts, but that's one area. The other area where, again, it's unclear what's going to happen, but the new legislation requires a to-be-formed entity within the Maryland State Attorney General's office to investigate all police officer-involved shootings that result in a civilian's death. Right now, in the city of Baltimore, the Public Integrity Bureau's Special Investigation Response Team, the CERT team, conducts both administrative and criminal investigations of all serious uses of force, including police officer-involved shootings, and including police officer-involved shootings that result in civilian deaths. There is an open question that we're going to have to discuss with the parties and ultimately with the court about whether the CERT team will continue to do criminal investigations of police officer-involved shootings resulting in civilian deaths. No question that the CERT team will continue to conduct internal administrative internal administrative investigations of those types of death resulting shootings. But it is an open question, at least in the monitoring team's mind at this point, about whether the CERT team will continue to conduct criminal investigations of police officer involved shootings resulting in civilian deaths, whether that will now be conducted or will be conducted in the future by this new unit within the State Attorney General's office, or whether the CERT team will work in hand with the to be created unit within the State Attorney General's office to investigate police officer involved shootings that result in civilian deaths. So those are the two big things where I think we need to answer some questions. Well, two big areas where things will or could change. One is in the area of how discipline gets imposed, and the other could be, though it remains to be seen, in the area of whether the CERT team continues to conduct criminal as distinct from administrative investigations of officer involved shootings resulting in deaths.
Seth, just a quick question on that. I think it's all in custody deaths, isn't it? Not just shootings. I mean, George Floyd was not a shooting,
You may be right, Chuck. I need to go back and look at the legislative language. I don't have it in front of me, but you may be right on that. And while we field the next question, I'll circle back to that.
So I'm going to pause right there just to see if we have any questions. That was a lot to digest. So do we have anything from Facebook, Donna?
Yes, we do. So I'm going to go with Trey Murphy first. Given the current amount of understanding, as was mentioned by Ken, that services such as mental health issues should be handled by mental health professionals, doesn't that change have an impact on the BPD staffing plan? If responsibilities are being reduced from BPD, shouldn't that reduce the need for so much staffing, given that the staffing plans was created based on current responsibilities at the time the study was conducted?
Let me take a first crack at it, then the guys can follow up. You know, it's hard to say. You know, the staffing plan was done by a group of experts, and I think that before any changes are made to that staffing plan, I think experts need to look at it again. Having said that, you got to keep in mind a couple of basic facts. First of all, you have about 12,000 calls for service that in some way, shape, or form involve mental health issues. I understand that there's somewhere between 700,000 and 800,000 calls for service on a yearly basis that involve other issues. So if you just look at those raw numbers, just starting there, you know, while 12,000 is a lot, it's certainly not a lot in terms of the overall calls for service that the department has to deal with. The other thing that we have to keep in mind is that clearly the consent decree, and I think the department is really trying to reimagine its role in terms of how you can divert people away from the criminal justice system where possible, and where possible, keep the police out of the event altogether. Now, there may be some occurrences when a social worker and or a psychologist can arrive at a scene and perhaps deal with one type of incident. There may be other incidents, however, where even if there's a social worker and or a mental health person available, because of potential public safety issues, you're still going to need police, even if in a backup capacity. So they are still going to have to respond. And then there are those events that are clearly public safety events where, you know, the psychiatrist and or social worker can be there, but they will not be able to take a firsthand approach just because it would be life-threatening to them. So there are occasions, you know, when, I mean, it's a combination of factors that one has to look at. So to answer your question, I think it's too early to determine if, in fact, that's going to reduce the need for staffing. As it stands right now, the department is so short of staffing in terms of patrol, that I would venture to guess that even if they had the best mental health system in place right now, that wouldn't dramatically change the staffing plan. And I will also have to say this, I mean, there's a reality here. It's nice to talk about having mental health providers who can be available, but you're looking at folks that are going to have to respond to calls for service within minutes. You can't wait 2, 3, 4 hours or the next day. And the question we have right now is the mental health system, is it big enough, large enough, and comprised of enough people where they can really take this role on? This is part of what the gap analysis was designed to do when when the consent decree mandated that the city take on the onus of having a gap analysis done. I think the parties are really working hard to try to figure out a way to put enough people in place so that there is a robust mental health community that can respond at some point in time to these calls. But as we stand right now, this is a plan in motion. Maybe in a few years, that you may have enough mental health folks on the ground who can respond to these calls for service in a timely fashion. But I'm afraid right now, I'm not sure there's enough. Even if we had the system in place, I'm not so sure that there are enough mental health professionals available that can respond to this number of calls in a timely manner. But again, it's just a guess on my part. And as I said before, I think this is certainly something that the department needs to look at. I mean, it's not only with respect to how you handle behavioral disorders, but you also have technology, which may also impact the need for staffing. So I think, and the consent decree requires this, there ought to be a revisiting of the staffing plan at some point in time to update it, to figure out, just what may be needed, let's say at the end of this year or next year or whatever. So that's kind of my preliminary response.
Yeah, Ken,
I was getting ready to answer that. Someone else want to chime in? That was a great question.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. Let me just add to what Ken says, and it won't be much. And Judge Berdar actually addressed this at the last quarterly hearing. And he made the point that the way the consent decree works is not to reduce staffing before the behavioral health support system is improved. It's to address the staffing levels after improvements to the behavioral health system are made, for the very reasons Ken says. Right now, the city of Baltimore does not have a behavioral health system that permits or that can respond 24/7 to people in crisis. It doesn't. Major Bartness, who runs the training academy, testified in front of the Senate last Thursday, said that, look, there is a crisis response team that includes mental health professionals that partner up with BPD officers to respond to certain mental health crises. But that team is available only 8 hours a day, not 24/7 at this point. So to Ken's point and to Judge Berdar's point, and what Judge Berdar says is, look, it may well be, as Ken says, that a year and a half down the road, 2 years down the road, BPD is going to have to take another look at its staffing once the behavioral health system in Baltimore is beefed up. But before that support system is beefed up, you wouldn't have anybody there to respond to calls for service at certain times of the day, and you can't have that kind of gap in city services. Chuck, you've had experience with this yourself. So
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. 12,000 calls for service, and let's say in the best case scenario, half of those might be such that, you wouldn't need police to be there as a first responder, but the other half you would. I mean, many of these situations can be quite volatile, and it's going to take time before mental health services can be beefed up to a point where if someone calls on a Friday night at 3 a.m., there's someone there to respond. This isn't unique to Baltimore, by the way. There are cities across America that are struggling with this same thing. One of the models that probably so far has shown the most promise is the one that Seth alluded to, where there is an officer and a mental health professional actually riding together that respond to these things. And Eventually, maybe it could be entirely mental health professional, but again, you have to take time to really allow them to staff up. The reason police respond now and are the first responders is because in many cities, social services budgets have been cut every year. And that obviously impacts staffing. So when you look at mental health, you look at substance abuse, you look at homeless outreach, these are all areas where police don't necessarily need to be first responders. But until those agencies that are responsible for that can get staffed up to the appropriate level to be available to actually deal with the volume of calls, police are going to still have to handle it. So that is something that has to be revisited. It's not going to happen immediately, but it is something that, you know, if things go the way they should go, eventually would have a positive impact on the need to have as many police on staff as you currently have. But that's a ways down the road.
Yeah, and I'll just say, you know, to the community member's question, and his name escapes me right now, Ray, I apologize. But the reason that we've spent a lot of time answering this question is because it is really important, and you really have, you know, hit the nail on the head when it comes to asking the right question about police staffing levels and how behavioral health systems impact police staffing levels. That's a question, as Chuck said, that's being asked in every major city across the country appropriately right now. And it's a question that actually has been addressed by the consent decree itself, with the idea being that Baltimore as a city must address the needs in its behavioral health system before it's able potentially to reduce the number of officers that it needs for patrol.
Thank you, guys. And his name was Trey Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy.
Thank you, Trey. That was a good question.
Great question.
Very good question.
Do we have any other questions, D?
Yep, we have a, first of all, we have a statement and then a question. The statement is coming from Shannon Nicholson. She says, it seems that solving the mental health and staffing issue could be a formal partnership with BHSB for crisis response. Forming outside partnerships would also have quickest implementation. More changes would actually happen at dispatch and triage. Best example I'm aware of is Cahoots in Washington State.
Right.
This is a
Exactly
chance
right.
to revise. This is a chance to revise and refresh all the things that couldn't happen before. There are other outreach teams that beg for partnerships and other grassroots efforts. There's a lot to labor regulation issues. So that was Shannon Nicholson's statement. We have a question from Janet Allen.
Hey, Darnell, before you move on to Miss Allen's statement,
Okay.
I mean, I wonder if we can address that last comment, because
Oh,
it's
sure.
exactly right. And I saw Chuck nodding his head in response, and Ken has been doing a lot of work himself together with our fellow team member, Randy DuPont, with the Collaborative Planning and Implementation Committee, which includes prominently BHSB as one of the leaders. So I wonder if y'all can address that, because I think the question, the comment is right on point.
Well, it is right on point, and she's absolutely right. And BHSP and BCRI are all intimately involved in the effort to figure out a way to reimagine this part of the police response to those who have mental health issues. You know, there's also funding. There's something, I know the acronym, it's called GBRICS, but I forgot what it stands for. But there's state money out here that's in the plan that BHSP is looking at. So, I mean, I think the gap analysis did a really good job of identifying exactly what it was supposed to, which is the gap, which is what we've been talking about. But as Chuck has said, and as you said, Seth, I mean, it's going to take, you know, it's going to take some time to be able to beef up, you know, the mental health provider community. I mean, first of all, you've got to have enough folks who are in that field who are willing to do this kind of work. And so there's a lot of stuff out there. It's being looked at. I think over time, this will work. But, you know, at least for now, I think we are at least a year, maybe more, away from being able to even figure out what the appropriate analysis would be with staffing. But I agree with Chuck and with you, Chuck, Seth, that that at some point in time, the staffing study needs to be, and the staffing plan needs to be revisited. So, I mean, that's my comment on that.
Yeah, and just very quickly, I mean, she points to cahoots, and that is a promising model that many departments are looking at. But again, staffing becomes an issue. And just from my own perspective here, when we talk about staffing, especially in the field of mental health, we can't look at it strictly as having people to be able to respond to a 911 call. We have to look at this so that we can have intervention that really can avoid people having the need to call 911 with people who are at risk, that are suffering, so it doesn't get to a 911 call. That requires staffing as well when we have people that unfortunately we know, suffer from, the disease of some mental health issue. But they aren't able to get the kind of services they need. And it just escalates to a point where eventually the behavior gets to a point where it results in a 911 call. The fewer 911 calls we get, the better. But we need to service the people so that they're getting the kind of intervention that they need to have so it doesn't rise to that level. And so that's going to require additional people as well. So we shouldn't look at this strictly through a response lens.
Right. And then there's also the back end of the equation, Chuck, where, we're talking about, trying to have the resources available so you never have the 911 calls in the first place. But that where on the back end, when you do get the 911 calls and we're dealing with the person in crisis, rather than the sort of limited dual options of sending the person to the hospital for commitment or sending them to the jail for lockup, there's actually an integrated support network of community mental health service providers that are there to get the person, to receive the person who's being diverted from either of those less than desirable outcomes. And that's, one of the main things that this Collaborative Planning Implementation Committee, CPIC, is working with. And again, CPIC involves BAHSB, BCRI, city and the mayor's office, BPD, people with lived experience, hospitals, people in the advocacy committee, including Disability Rights Maryland. So it's a very well representative body that's working on these issues and looking at these problems and how to solve them.
Seth, you said that was a question, D?
Yep. Thank you, Seth, Ken, and Charles and Chuck for weighing in on that statement. So we have a question from Janet Allen. Since this consent decree, it feels like the BPD is taking a knee. As a community member, I feel really uneasy and skeptical about the new changes taking place. And our community can't breathe because the intersections are filled with drug addicts, squeegee kids, and panhandlers. How can we have equity in policing when the police is doing nothing about having all these groups of people in one area which draws crime? Drug dealers are murdering not just for territory, but for drug addicts for the drug market, and we are allowing certain neighborhoods to bear the brunt. How can the police make our community safe?
Chuck, you want to take a shot at this?
Well, I mean, listen, I mean, that's a legitimate question and a legitimate concern. We have to strike the balance. What people, at least the majority of people that I have spoken to, aren't saying they want no police. They just want good policing, constitutional policing. And I think that you don't have to sacrifice one for the other. In other words, to get a handle on the kinds of issues that you just raised in your question. That's something that chiefs across the country are facing. I was in a meeting last week in which, that same discussion took place. Police kind of pulling back a little bit out of concern and with all the controversy swirling around and so forth. But in the meantime, communities are really under it. And we have to find a way to kind of strike that balance where we can continue to police in a professional and constitutional way and not just lay back or, as you put it, take a knee. I know that Commissioner Harrison is working very hard addressing the issue of morale with the men and women of BPD. But again, and I hate to keep saying it, it's not just a Baltimore problem. This is something that I know chiefs have been talking about for a while. You couple that with the fact that staffing is an issue, low staffing, and rising crime in many of our cities, it is a challenge. There's no question about that.
Thank you, Chuck.
That's it for
Any other
now, Ray.
questions? You said that was no more questions, D?
Yeah, that's it for now.
So what's the time check? It's 10 minutes to 8.
7:49 I got.
Do we go for an hour or do we go for an hour and a half?
Play it by ear.
Okay, so I think that was a real important and informational session we had just there, and hopefully we've got a little more clarity on the impact of this past session, and if not, we at least got an idea of a timeline for more clarity. So I guess now we kind of turn back around to this week's public hearing. Ken, do you guys want to talk about what's going to be covered, the main topics for the public hearing discussion?
Yeah, I can start, and Seth and Chuck can chime in. Obviously, we will deal with technology. We'll deal with transport of individuals who are in custody. And what's the third one, Seth or Chuck?
Sex assault investigation.
Yes, sexual assault. So those would be the topics that we would focus on to some extent. But I think this judge is always interested in what he calls his global four. So there will be significant discussions on staffing, because that is, a major challenge in the department. We'll discuss integrity, because we're concerned about a number of things in the Public Integrity Bureau. Technology, I think it's moving along, as I said, apace, and things seem to be moving well. But the importance of technology is so obvious. I mean, in order for us, being the monitoring team, to be able to do our job and evaluate the data, this technology system is going to have to be up and running. And so I know that's going to be a topic of discussion. So I think, the three subjects that we just discussed, plus the global four, will be part and parcel of this discussion. I wouldn't be surprised if the judge, in recognition of all that's happened over the last month with the murder trial in Minneapolis, Chauvin, and the shootings of the murders, the killings, I shouldn't say murders, but the killings that have taken place of in most cases Black males, and in one case a Black female, he may raise some issues with that. But I think it's going to be a very, very interesting quarterly hearing. And so I would really, really invite the public to join in, because I think this will be one of great interest.
Thank you, Ken. Did any Seth, you or Chuck want to chime in on that?
I'll just reiterate what I said a few minutes ago, which is that one of the things that the judge also recently ordered us to address, all the parties and the monitoring team, is whether we think the recent reform legislation enacted by the General Assembly is going to have any impact on the consent decree. So we'll be prepared to address that to the court as well.
So
Hey,
since
Chuck,
we,
let me ask, Chuck, if you don't mind, can you spend just a little bit of time talking about the community policing plan? Because again, from my perspective, and I think yours and Seth's and our team, we look at that area as really, at the end of the day, being in addition to integrity being a linchpin in terms of regaining trust in the community. We certainly look at the community policing aspect as being, the benchmark in terms of how this department is going to work towards that end. So if you don't mind, can you just spend a few minutes telling people what that's all about?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the training is the pilot training is taking place. There's been a lot of revisions in the training to get officers to understand the plan, to understand what they're expected to do. One area that I think it needs improvement, and this came up both from the Department of Justice as well as the monitoring team, and we've had some conversations with BPD about it, and that is improving the community engagement piece of this. The regularity of interactions between the department and community to really listen to their concerns, to problem solve, to provide feedback, including feedback on progress being made on the consent decree. That's all part of community policing. You know, you can have community engagement without community policing, but you can't have community policing without community engagement. And so there has to be a focus on that as well. One of the things I like the most about the training that is taking place, or at least beginning to take place, is they do spend time talking about the history of policing in Baltimore. And I think that's a very important piece because, you know, many officers were not on the job when some of these, well, some of the more recent incidents maybe, but when you go back historically in the city of Baltimore and police and how they were used to, you know, enforce laws that were discriminatory or things of that nature, it's good to know the history so that you understand the baggage that as a profession police carry, especially with certain communities. You can't fix a problem until you really understand the nature and extent of it. And that's all part of the community policing. 40% of their time is what the goal is, to be able to be out of the car and positively, proactively problem solving and being engaged with the community. That's not going to happen overnight. We had that conversation earlier about staffing, calls for service, things of that nature. But it is a goal that they're going to work toward to see just how they can achieve that, to get everyone involved. And it's not just uniform patrol. Everyone in the department has to have that mindset of being a community-oriented officer. That's Ken mentioned earlier, you know, the guardian mindset versus a warrior mindset. And everyone needs to have that, whether they're detectives or uniform patrol or whatever their assignment might be. Every contact that they make needs to be one where the respect and the concern and empathy toward members of our community is something that really should be first and foremost in terms of that interaction. And that's really what it all boils down to. It's getting out of that car, it's getting to know people in the neighborhood that you serve, it's continuity of assignment. That's part of it, trying to have the same officers assigned to the same areas on a regular basis, because that's the only way you really become familiar. When you have these meetings, it's not just where you sit back and let people tell you or complain about various things. You actually identify what are those chronic crime and disorder problems that exist, and how do you go about trying to have an impact? You may not solve it completely, but you can have an impact on it. But you do that working with the community by leveraging city resources in addition to that, really staying focused on what's taking place and who's responsible for the disorder issues. And so there's a combination of things. Some fall under the umbrella of community policing. Policing lesser offenses is something that's part of that. Those types of things that really have an impact on quality of life, but really don't rise to your serious criminal level. How should police actually handle those things so we don't alienate the community? All those things are part of the community policing plan and strategy that's being put in place. I know, Seth, you've done a lot around the lesser offenses part of this, but I mention it because it is an essential part of community policing, in my opinion.
Thanks, Chuck. Okay, we just wanted to make sure that everybody knows that the quarterly public hearing with Judge Bridar is this week, the 30th at 10 a.m. And Jess, or if you or Darnell could share the Zoom link on the Facebook Live as well, that would be great. But I think it'd be a a very interesting public hearing this month, because like Chuck alluded to, and so did Ken, that the judge is working in real time, and he's going to have a lot of comments and insight on the changes coming to the state and the country through legislation, and how we actually keep the consent decree on track through all of it. Like Ken said, this is a working mechanism. It's nothing that we can hit a switch tomorrow and change will be there. And we want to make sure that we're intentional as we move forward into these actual alternatives to law enforcement, and ensure that we're putting it together, taking our time, and it works the first time. Any more questions, D?
We do not have a question, but we do have, well, first of all, Ms. Wanda asks, can the community attend the hearing? And I don't think it's going to be an in-person hearing, Ms. Wanda, but you can always attend through the Zoom link that was put into the in the chat. Ms. Janet Allen has a statement. So the policy of allowing squeegee kids, panhandlers, and drug addicts to remain on our intersection is protecting those on the intersection, but hurting those whom live in the community. And this probably speaks a little bit to the SAO's new policy also a little bit.
Does anybody want to comment on that?
You know, I'm going to say something real quick because some people suggest that somehow the consent decree has something to do with this taking the knee business, and I vehemently dispute that. What the consent decree does, the consent decree requires police officers to effectively engage in law enforcement activities, but they're supposed to do it in a constitutional way, and that's really all the consent decree is talking about. When you get into, you know, what's going on the street corners, what police are doing and not doing, that really goes back to, that's the commissioner's strategy. Not that that's what he's promoting, but the bottom line is he has a crime plan that's distinct from the consent decree. And of course, as I said before, the consent decree simply requires police officers to engage in law enforcement activity, but they must do it in a constitutional way. So I don't see, there's no reason to believe that if you have constitutional policing, you're going to have crime. I mean, that's just not the way it works.
Thank you, Ken. Any other questions, D?
Nope, that was our last statement.
All right, so I guess it's time to close this all out. I just wanted to take a minute and make a personal announcement. So a lot of people have heard, and there's been chatter, and that chatter is true. At the end of my term with the monitoring team in June, I will be moving on to a more community-based position. So I am part of a large open society grant in partnership with Organizing Black and CASA and our partners at CJSJ on the Divest Invest initiative. And I feel like as we transcend back into an executive office that's once again focused on reform, I've been real encouraged by the DOJ's rejuvenated participation in our consent decree, and I feel confident it's a perfect time to once again organize people around the process. You heard Ken talking about the gaps analysis and the upcoming engagement around filling those gaps, as well as what Chuck said, continuing to inform and educate and actually help people engage in this process as we move through to implementation of some of these new policies and trainings as we start to see them on the street. Our voices at the community and grassroots level become that much more important. And I'm looking forward to doing more organizing. I'm looking forward to elevating more voices, and I'm looking forward to continue working with different organizations, entities, as well as the parties of the consent decree to, as we use the term, all hands on deck, find a solution. So a big piece of this divest, invest is actually finding out how we fill those gaps that we found in the CPIC report with not just community-based organizations, but proven community-based solutions. So I'm looking forward to continuing this work as we move into another era of police reform in Baltimore City. And I'm excited to see and introduce more of the public to some of the mechanisms that we've brought into this process and actually utilize them. So that's my big major announcement. I don't know if anyone has anything to add.
Oh, Ray, I'm going to add this. I'm going to say this. We're going to miss you. You have been an extremely valuable partner in this process. We obviously will continue to work with you because we're all moving in this direction. You'll be with a different unit, but we'll all be moving in the same direction to reform this department. But you have done an incredible job. We're really proud of you, and I'm happy that you're moving on to something that you're happy with. We're sorry to lose you, but because you're going to leave a big void, and you got a big footprint. It's going to be difficult to fill it, but I know we can count on you to work with us. And so, again, I look forward to working with you as you move into the next chapter of your life.
And I agree with Ken. I really do. It's been a pleasure working with you. I look forward to working with you again in the future. And I can say this, Ray, you've had an impact on not just the consent decree, but on the city of Baltimore, on your city, with all the work you've done prior to the consent decree, with this consent decree, and what you'll do in the future. And there aren't many people that really have that kind of impact as individuals. So I know it's tough work, but believe me, you're making a difference. And that's probably more important than anything. So God bless and good luck.
Thank you, Chuck.
Let me add, Ray, we'll be working with you for another couple months, but it really has been my privilege to work with you over these last couple of years. And I know that you are going to keep making the changes that Chuck was just referring to. Keep making the impact that you've been having in your new position.
And I just want to thank you guys for the opportunity, and I hope that my stewardship to the community has shown people and others like me that anything is possible, and if we commit, we can elevate. And I tell everyone that I'm not disengaging from this process in no sense of the word. I always say I wear a lot of hats when I'm in these meetings, and I'm simply taking a hat off, but I'll still be there. So you guys know that I'm a phone call away at all times.
Keep your phone on because we'll be calling.
Ray, on the Facebook, you're getting lots of celebration and community welcoming you back. I know your faith calls you to be a servant leader. And as someone who shares that call with you, I've always been so ardently impressed with what you give to Baltimore, will continue to give to Baltimore, and are always thinking forward in your own life how you can contribute that back. We can't thank you enough for your time. It's been so valuable.
Right. And I want to thank everybody that's recognized it on Facebook, because my work has always been to elevate another voice and to help another person. And it's because the community has been willing to share their traumas, their impacts, and their ideas with me. I've been able to bring that to the table, and together we've been able to impact the changes that we're seeing now with the consent decree. So I thank everyone, including the court, for the opportunity to allow me to serve at this level.
This is not goodbye, sir. For me, I'll still see you in these streets.
Oh, I'm going to still see you in the rooms. I'm just going to have on a CPP hat.
All right, guys. Well, thank you all. Thank you, Ray.
Thanks, everyone, and everyone have a good evening. And I'm looking forward to seeing you guys in the next phase.
See ya. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.